Good evening. On behalf of Columbia University's Institute of Latin American Studies and the Center for Mexican and Central American Studies at Columbia and the Cuba program, we're very happy to welcome you to update U.S. policy towards Latin America, which will be led by Cynthia Arnson of the Latin American program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, where she is the director. And she has had a very long, although she's still very young, career as an expert on Latin American politics, political economy, and international relations, including U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. She is quoted frequently in major U.S. and Latin American media and has testified on numerous occasions before committees of the U.S. Congress. She herself worked on Capitol Hill as a congressional aide in her youth. Our second speaker is Mark Schneider, who's a senior advisor with the Americans Program and the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He has had a very long public service career spanning government, international organizations, civil society, and academia. And his areas of expertise include post-conflict reconstruction and nation building, U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century, human rights, and Latin American and Caribbean issues, including Haiti. Before we begin with Cynthia Arnson, I want to introduce the Cuba program team. We have here Gretchen Sanchez, who has served since 2019 as the Cuba program assistant and who is going to be leading us shortly for a much better paying job, etc. And we're very sorry to lose her. And leaning over my shoulder is her replacement, Ellen Johnson, who's a first-year Columbia University graduate student and formerly worked with some of the people we know and love, Phil Brenner and others at American University, where she received her degree in international affairs, summa cum laude. So she'll probably take over the program in about 2 weeks or so, etc. We're going to begin, as I said, with Cynthia Arnson, who's going to give us an overview of U.S. policy towards Latin America today. Cindy?
Great. Thanks so much, Professor Crahan. Thanks to the whole team, Gretchen and others at Columbia University for this opportunity. We were all expecting big things from the change of administration from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. And I'd like to run through some of the major themes of Biden foreign policy, but also make the argument that the major focus up until now has been on domestic policy, and there's very little concretely that we've seen towards the region. That could change in the very near term. It's only in the last 10 days or so that the Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, Brian Nichols, a career diplomat, was finally confirmed by the Senate. So the key position in the State Department for diplomacy has been vacant since Biden was inaugurated in January, and I think things may now accelerate. I think it's fair to say that that the Biden administration always knew that the first year would be devoted to domestic issues. Biden took office with a pandemic that was still raging. Vaccines now have been broadly available in the United States, but I don't think anyone necessarily anticipated the Delta variant or the difficulty of getting the pandemic under control, facing an economy that was still struggling with massive levels of unemployment, new people on the unemployment payrolls, and many more thrown into poverty. He had announced during the campaign really only one Latin America theme, and that was Central America, which we'll hear about a little bit more from Mark Schneider, which was a $4 billion plan to address what he called, and what I think is referred to throughout Washington as addressing the root causes of migration, trying to contrast his approach with the approach that the Trump administration took, which focused on the border wall, on ending refugee admissions, keeping people out of the United States while asylum claims were being heard through the courts, the famous stay in Mexico policy, the so-called safe third country agreements, by which countries like Guatemala, which themselves were sending migrants, agreed with the Trump administration to house and shelter migrants before they would reach the U.S. border. So there was, there was a positive statement that the Biden approach would be different, but Central America, because of its strong implications for the United States in terms of the number of Central American migrants, was really the only foreign policy issue related to the Americas that he had talked about. There's often a sense among Latin Americanists, and certainly in the region as a whole, that nobody pays attention to Latin America, that it's always, the last issue on the agenda behind other bigger national security issues like Russia or Iraq or Afghanistan, the nuclear, North Korea, those kinds of big issues. And I think that it's true that Latin America bursts into, the White House and into the front sort of lines of policymaking when there is a crisis. But again, the hope was that Biden, because of his long experience in the Senate as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, his 8 years as vice president during the Obama administration, in which he was explicitly the point person on Latin America, that there would be a pretty big shift. That has not happened. And I think there are a number of reasons for it. As I mentioned, the naming of an assistant secretary was fairly early in the administration, only confirmed as of mid-September. There are also people who criticize the United States for not having a kind of grand strategy or a strategic approach to the region. And I often take issue with that desire for a grand strategy. I don't think that there is any one-size-fits-all approach. There probably hasn't been such a grand strategy since the Kennedy administration and the announcement of the Alliance for Progress. And a lot of that is because the hemisphere right now is far too diverse and fragmented to a degree that many of us, and I'm sure that Professor Crahan can comment on this, is more fragmented now than I think I have ever seen in my 40-some years following the region and following US policy towards the region. Contrast, for example, the growing authoritarianism of governments such as Bolsonaro's Brazil or Nayib Bukele's El Salvador, with a country such as Ecuador that went from a populist government to a more liberal, democratic, free trade, pro-business president in the last election with Guillermo Lasso. Chile in the midst of ferment, but with institutional processes underway, the writing of a new constitution, a presidential election later this year. Argentina in the throes of yet another economic crisis, worse probably than we've seen in a long time, with Peronism in the Casa Rosada, but very humbled in the last congressional primaries that were held just a few weeks ago. Peru, where the runoff election that was held earlier this year seemed to be a race to the bottom, and the two worst candidates were facing off. And a lot of people, and both of them with high negatives, and a very difficult time governing. Anyway, so the region is very fragmented. It is hard for the administration to have a comprehensive approach as opposed to a country by country approach. Note that I have not mentioned the Caribbean. I have not yet mentioned Venezuela. We'll get to that later. But I would drive home that point that the hemisphere is extremely diverse. The kinds of alliances that had formed in the region previously, either a new trade alliance such as the Pacific Alliance consisting of Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, is fairly moribund right now. The Lima Group, which had formed among democratic nations in the region to try to serve as a bridge to force democratic change in Venezuela, is also in complete disarray, with certain of the original members having left. And two important countries, Argentina and Mexico, no longer in sync with the rest of the neighborhood, as it were. So let me just mention what I do think the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for in terms of resetting a tone and a discourse around policy. And I think a lot of people are, again, very frustrated that the tone and the discourse has yet to be really followed up with substance. But let me just lay out some of the themes that constitute an overall sort of mindset or a set of concerns that will shape engagement with the hemisphere. One, again, in contrast to the Trump administration, is a support for democracy, for human rights, for efforts to fight corruption. Later this year, in the first 10 days or so of December, there will be a global democracy summit in which Latin American countries, some of Latin American countries will be participating to sort of try to drive home that that authoritarianism is on the march around the world. The unnamed targets of that, Russia and China, are obvious, but also that trend is very present in our hemisphere. Another major theme which has caused a great deal of discomfort in Latin America is the way hemisphere relations are shaped by the broader renewed Cold War, if you will, or a new form of Cold War between the United States and China. Latin America is very much seen as an area of US-China competition. It was seen that way certainly during the Trump administration, where there was an effort to revive the Monroe Doctrine, which was the 19th century doctrine that said that extra hemispheric powers had no business having relationships with countries in the hemisphere, and that their doing so would be considered threatening to the United States. And there was a great deal of not only rhetorical pushback, but an attempt to use the so-called mask diplomacy to help the region respond to the COVID pandemic. That very much led, made Latin America's struggle with the pandemic a subject of US-China competition. We can get into that later in the Q&A if you're interested. My sense is that China was much more forthcoming, at least initially, much more visible in delivering masks and personal protective equipment. The Trump administration explicitly banned the export of those things. whereas it did allow the export of things like ventilators as countries were trying to increase the capacity of their ICUs. And right now we see it in terms of vaccine diplomacy. China was out there first in terms of distributing, mostly selling the Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines. A lot of countries had contracts with China for the delivery of vaccines. Most of the vaccines that were initially given in places like Chile, even Brazil, were Chinese vaccines. But in terms of the number of donated vaccines, the United States is far, far ahead of China. And I think that, as we step back and see Latin America within a broader lens of US global policy, US-China competition is going to be a very important framework for understanding US efforts in the region. And I'll provide a detail about that later. I mentioned the assistance with pandemic recovery just recently, and I think it's because most people in the United States who have wanted vaccines have been able to get them, that there is a sense that there are more vaccines that can be donated, not only through the global COVAX facility, but also bilaterally. Of the number of vaccines that have been donated to the world, Latin America really has a disproportionate number compared with other regions, Asia, Africa, the Middle East. Another important theme for the Biden administration in domestic policy, in foreign policy, and in its policy towards Latin America is fighting climate change and confronting what Biden and his administration, I think, rightly see as an existential threat to the planet, to our children, grandchildren, to the generation of students now and in your lifetime and in the lifetime of any descendants that you might have. And that also involves and encompasses a sense of helping countries transition away from fossil fuels to green energy, to solar, to wind, to green hydrogen, to electric vehicles and that kind of thing. That, of course, is problematic in Latin America. Many countries are oil exporters. That includes Brazil. It also includes Colombia. It certainly includes Venezuela, who's, petroleum exports, are a trickle of what they were 10, 20 years ago. Ecuador, also an important oil exporter. Argentina, in terms of shale gas. I mean, so as Latin America is looking to recover from the pandemic and the tremendous economic contractions and increases in poverty and inequality as a result of COVID, is actually doubling down on the hydrocarbons sector, not exclusively, but as a necessary engine of growth. And so there's a kind of tension in that. Biden already held a climate summit earlier this year. There were a number of Latin American countries that were invited, including Brazil, which was a surprise to many people given Bolsonaro's policies vis-a-vis the deforestation of the Amazon and the unwillingness to halt that process. And I think the calculation was that it's much better to have people, at the table inside the room than outside the room. I've mentioned briefly, and Mark will get into some detail about dealing with Central America, not only to address the root causes of migration, but also through the lens of governance and trying to shore up the anti-corruption fight, which is at a particularly low point right now. The difficulty, as I'm sure we can all see, is that addressing these root causes, violence, lack of development, lack of opportunity, these are long-term solutions that take a long time to take root and have an actual impact in people's lives, whereas the migration pressures are very immediate and in many ways have gotten worse because of the perception that Biden would have a kinder, gentler policy towards migrants. And as we all know, that really has not been the case, and Biden is under significant pressure from constituencies in the Democratic base and in Congress that are very unhappy with migration policy, and I'm sure Mark Schneider will talk later about what recently, horrified all of us in the news, the treatment of Haitian migrants on the US-Mexico border. Another common theme, which is difficult under the current circumstances, is a return to multilateralism. On the global stage, this is a sense that America is back. I think a lot of people are looking a bit askance at that message in light of the way that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was carried out. But there is a desire to work multilaterally, to not impose US policy unilaterally, and to also know that successful policy will have much broader buy-in by like-minded governments. And I think that this is a long-standing tradition, certainly within the Democratic Party since the Cold War, to seek multilateral solutions, to work with allies to get things done, to partner with others who might be able to even have better results than the United States alone. And then the final aspect, which is very real, and I think we're seeing it unfold, in front of our eyes, is the value placed on civil society as a key component of US strategies for partnering with other regions. To a lesser extent, the private sector. I mean, the private sector is part of civil society, although I think recently civil society has kind of gotten mushed into a sense that this means non-governmental organizations. It's actually a much broader concept, but the idea that you don't just deal government to government, that you deal not only civil society to civil society, but US government to civil society in the region. And you do that even more when the bilateral government to government relationship is difficult. I'm going to give you two concrete examples, but first I want to lay out what are the instruments, of US policy in Latin America. There's obviously discourse, there's the condemnation, tweets, testimony and hearings, diplomatic representations to foreign ambassadors, as we have seen, say, in the case of Nicaragua, where the behavior of governments that is offensive in terms of repression or authoritarianism is identified as such and is hammered on as such. The ability to achieve results somewhat up in the air, but it's important, I think, all of us who sort of came of age, Mark, probably you and Professor Crahan, more maturely involved in these struggles against the dictatorships in South America in the 1970s. These are the struggles over which I sort of cut my baby teeth dealing with Latin America policy. It was important to speak out. It was important to condemn. And it was important to use the instruments that were available, whether it was an OAS resolution, although the OAS back in those days was a very different body, or forms of US assistance and especially support for the military. So foreign aid is still an important tool, but as we know that there are bilateral assistance programs with many countries, but by no means all countries. There are a number of middle-income countries that have very small U.S. assistance programs and have sort of graduated into this sphere of middle-income countries. But aid and conditions on aid have always been a form of, I think, of positive engagement and encouragement to say, we can't do this, but if you do that, that kind of thing. Then there is coercive diplomacy. And this is where I will get into the discussion of the concrete case of Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world, particularly by the United States. The Obama administration talks about how, the sanctions policy began during the Obama administration. It's true if you look at the individual sanctions, the application of sanctions against people who were seen as responsible for crushing protests, peaceful protests in 2014, or leading the kind of kleptocracy that Venezuela represents. But the sanctions policy really took off, if you will, under the Trump administration, with this idea that if you exerted maximum pressure, and those are terms that were used by US officials, somehow you would cause cracks in the regime, you would cause the regime to collapse, whatever. It was a sense that you would bear down with every economic instrument, given that, Venezuela is a country that exports 90% of its export income, probably more now, comes from oil. The United States, up until the sanctions on the oil sector, was an important purchaser of Venezuelan oil after Venezuelan exports to Russia and China and other countries. But there were a number of refineries in the Gulf states of the United States that were still important customers. There were financial sanctions, and then late in the administration, and I believe it was August of 2020, so-called secondary sanctions on not only on Venezuelans, but on other countries of any stripe who did business with Venezuela. Now, there was some sense, and I think there was a desire by the government in Venezuela of Nicolas Maduro to reach out to the Biden administration to look for a different approach. And the Biden administration, with one very limited exception, which is to allow purchases of cooking gas, has not relaxed any of the sanctions. It has called in coordination with the European Union and the Canadian government for a process of democratization, for a process of negotiations, which are underway in Mexico City right now, that would lead to free and fair elections and a return to democracy. And as that process goes forward and bears fruit, then the United States and other countries would be willing to discuss with the Venezuelan government a relaxation of sanctions policy. So the policy is very much on hold, and it has been in many ways a continuation of the Trump approach, except that there is a recognition that the policy of maximum pressure has failed, that the ball is back in the court of Venezuelans to come up with a process that they will embrace. The opposition now sitting down, with the Maduro government, although still fighting a number of internal battles over what those negotiations should consider. And then at some point, should there be movement in a democratization process and actual elections and people allowed, to take office and to actually do things, I think we can see a relaxation of that policy of coercive diplomacy. And I think I will probably stop there. We can talk about Colombia, where I think it's business as usual. The primordial emphasis on countering narcotics is there, but so are other issues, including implementation of the peace agreement that is sort of, depending on how you time it, either in September or November, celebrating its 5th anniversary. So I hope that that has not been too long-winded, and I will turn things back over to Professor Crahan.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Definitely not long-winded and very incisive in terms of the general aspects of U.S. policy to date. We'll now move to Mark Schneider, who you left a lot of questions in your comments to Mark. So, Mark, answer all of the questions, please.
Okay, let me thank Meg, who's a longtime friend, one of the most knowledgeable Latin American scholars, for this invitation, and especially to share the platform with Cindy, who's not only a true scholar, but also one of the savviest readers of Latin American policy in Washington. Okay, we're in 2021, a new decade with a new president, Joe Biden, and it's legitimate to ask, what's changed? What does it or will it mean for U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean? I think I, to some degree, agree with Cindy. In some degree, I would dispute a little bit the idea that there hasn't been a fairly significant shift in the way that Latin America views Joe Biden and the U.S. attitude towards Latin America, and what the Biden administration already has done. Although I agree with her totally that to some degree, the greatest impact has been the impact of its global policies on Latin America. And I'll get to that. So I did want to emphasize that every U.S. foreign policy is designed to advance the national interests of the United States. And with respect to the hemisphere, I think there have been certain, particularly within democratic administrations, but not only, generally accepted themes, and they're now being reasserted, and I hope more intelligently. First, protecting and reinforcing democratic values and institutions, including anti-corruption. Second, to contribute to a positive environment for U.S. economic well-being that also enables greater economic prosperity for the peoples of the Americas. Third, to join with other nations, and this importantly, seeing value in multilateral efforts in meeting regional and global challenges, whether communicable diseases like COVID-19, environmental threats, global warming, migration, and transnational crime, including controlling human, drugs, and arms trafficking. And finally, to ensure no threats to our security emanate from the region. That, I would say, are normal objectives. The question is, how is it going to be pursued? How are those objectives going to be pursued? Through cooperation or confrontation, through diplomacy or dictation, and respect rather than arrogance. And how we do that is going to determine, I think, our success and the nature of hemispheric relations. Now, to look to the future, Cindy did a little bit, I'm going to do a little bit more. It's not a bad idea, at least briefly, to look to the past. For me, granted, it's the recent past. For most of the students at this university, it's ancient history. For many Latin Americans, it has meant hope or despair, and in some ways, life or death. I too will start with 1961. John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as president with great hope and optimism, a vision largely shared throughout Latin America. He launched the Peace Corps, and Latin America was one of the regions where volunteers were warmly received. In the poor barrio in San Salvador, where I served as a volunteer, most of the two-room, tin-roofed, bamboo and adobe-walled homes had a picture of Jesus Christ and a cutout photo from a newspaper of John Kennedy. In March of 1961, the Alliance for Progress was born with calls for democracy, land and tax reform, and development cooperation to be managed by a new agency, USAID. But in April, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba occurred, followed by a never-ending embargo and a Cold War security framework that I think still haunts our relations. A decade later, John Kennedy's brother, Senator Ted Kennedy, argued that the alliance had failed because of Vietnam and the Cold War, particularly because that had resulted in subordinating social and economic goals to narrow definitions of security. He argued that the original alliance goals of democracy, social justice, and poverty elimination should underpin our foreign policy. He also called for an end to the Cuba embargo and to the Cold War prism. At the same time, the Nixon administration was acting to subvert the democratically elected Allende government in Chile. In 1981, Ronald Reagan came to office, immediately stating an intent to reverse the Carter human rights policy. In Central America, it reasserted the primacy of the Cold War, even to the extent of illegally selling arms to the Khomeini regime in Iran to fund the Contras to fight the Sandinistas in a civil war that lasted a decade. In El Salvador, 900 men, women, and children were massacred by the US-trained Atlacoatl Army Brigade that same year. In Guatemala, the military we supported carried out a genocide in Mayan communities during that nation's civil conflict. In 1991, and Cindy particularly has written excellently about this, a bipartisan congressional majority, and ultimately the Bush administration, supported UN-led peace negotiations and a democratic electoral transition in Nicaragua, signing on the last day of December an agreement ending the civil war in El Salvador. That also was the first year of a democratic successor to the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, and the election of a reformist priest in Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. Unfortunately, a military coup ousted him, and he was forced into exile. While all of our memories of 2001, 20 years ago, concentrate on the tragedy of 9/11, in Latin America, it also marked Aristide's second election as president, Venezuela's Hugo Chavez announcing a strategic partnership with China, and the signing, ironically, on the same 9/11, of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And I think it's useful to at least take a look at that charter, which I hope you're all seeing, which essentially set out the values and rights that needed to be, that all the countries attending at the OAS agreed, at the Lima General Assembly, agreed were basic to the hemisphere. And in Article 20, that in the event of a constitutional alteration that seriously impairs the democratic order, that any member country or the Secretary General could undertake a collective assessment, force the Permanent Council to undertake a permanent assessment and take action. In some ways, I think it's fair to say that at that moment, we all felt that the signing of the charter constituted an historic end to military and authoritarian rule in the region and the consolidation of democratic governments in the Americas. And I think we also thought, and I think now looking back, it probably was the peak of regional acceptance of the political role of the OAS. So where do we stand 20 years later in defining what is and should be US policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean? I'll be a little bit tougher than Cindy in terms of looking at the last 4 years, where we had an administration that described migrants as rapists and animals, focused on building a wall to stop that migration, and was silent when Guatemalan and Honduran governments ousted international anti-corruption bodies, CICIG and MOXIE. But it wasn't only that Trump's style and language were problems. Withdrawing the US from the Paris Climate Accord, withdrawing the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, withdrawing from the World Health Organization in the midst of the COVID crisis, all impacted the region. And when Trump cut and shifted more than $396 million in aid monies away from the Northern Triangle countries in 2019, It halted projects that directly addressed violence reduction, economic opportunity, and humanitarian aid, all aimed at lessening the drivers of migration. Those decisions, along with his halt in 2020 to funding the Pan American Health Organization, which serves in many ways as the region's CDC, undermined the ability of many governments in many countries to respond to threats to their nation's economies and to their citizens' health. Those policies had an impact on the region's attitude toward the United States. In 2015, the Pew Foundation reported that of the 7 largest countries, 66% on average had a favorable attitude toward this country. That number dropped after Trump's first year to 47%. In Mexico, it dropped from 66 to 30%. And in his last year, only 8% of Mexicans, 28% of Brazilians, and 22% of Argentines had confidence in Trump doing the right thing. Now, when you look overall at that history, what's clear is that U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean has been inconsistent and often incoherent under different administrations. So what is the policy and what should it be? Now, I will argue that until the recent fiasco, and it was a fiasco, and no question it was inhumane treatment of Haitian refugees, I think the Biden administration has, as Cindy said, been consistent in conveying a different attitude. And even Biden recognized what was happening on the border and calling what was done by the mounted border patrolmen horrible and outrageous. Of the total of 25 to 30,000 Haitian refugees, 12,400 have been allowed to request asylum. But given the horrendous conditions in Haiti, political and economic crises, on top of COVID, remember, you haven't had a government functioning in Haiti for nearly 2 years, and the now assassinated president was operating basically as a de facto ruler for these 2 years because he didn't hold elections for the parliament. At this point, and given COVID and the earthquake this year, it's simply unacceptable to deport any Haitians back at this time. And also, you should know that the United States government actually acknowledged as much as recently as July 29, when it extended temporary protected status to Haitians who are already here. Now, today you might not know that President Biden announced a rule that countered a court decision which barred him from reversing the Trump effort to cancel DACA. Now, that would permit about 1.2 million DACA recipients to remain here. And he also has introduced legislation which would enable the remaining 11 million undocumented to adjust their status. That effort has stalled, unfortunately, in the Senate after passing the House. My understanding is that there's going to be an effort to bring at least several pieces of that forward. There's one other area of policy where particularly this group should be very concerned, where the Biden administration has failed to carry out his campaign pledges, and that's Cuba. During the campaign, he said that he would return to the Obama-era policy of taking steps to end the isolation of Cuba, recognizing that 50 years of embargo had not brought that country closer to democratic change. That has not occurred. Next summer, there's supposed to be the Summit of the Americas in the United States. The last 2 summits have included Cuba, at the risk otherwise of no one showing up. However, given the Cuban government crackdown on protesters this summer, the Cuban issue during a congressional election year, and COVID, not to mention the views of the chair and ranking members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, question whether the summit will take place in 2022, it does not have a very clear answer. Now, as Cindy mentioned, in other areas, the Biden administration has supported democracy, rule of law, and anti-corruption. For the first time ever, a president has stated that anti-corruption constitutes, and I quote, a core national security interest, unquote. The executive order that stated that now charged government agencies to respond by December with recommendations for further actions. And last week, Biden at the UN said corruption fuels inequality, siphons off a nation's resources, spreads across borders, and generates human suffering. It is nothing less than a national security threat in the 21st century. I'd add, it also drives migration. Now, that's so different from the attitude of his predecessor, where the Trump White House showed time and again that it did not care about the issue of corruption. And that too had consequences in the countries, in the Northern Triangle countries particularly, where traditional elite power structures felt they could act with impunity to attack independent judges and prosecutors and harass anti-corruption advocates. I just would show you Transparency International. I believe I'll show you a Transparency International ranking in terms of corruption that shows, looking from the bottom, these are the countries that their publics feel are totally corrupt. Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Mexico, those are the worst. Canada, United States, Uruguay, and Chile, Costa Rica have shown the best record. There's no question that this is an issue that affects all of the countries of the region. And I would add that I think that to the degree that Biden continues to focus on it and takes action, I think that that'll have a positive impact in terms of U.S. relations in the region. By the way, USAID under Administrator Samantha Power has named an anti-corruption task force. Vice President Harris traveled to Guatemala and announced, which I think people missed, that there is now a Justice Department anti-corruption and trafficking task force that will mount cases affecting the region to be brought here, as well as in those countries. The Biden administration also has used the Magnitsky and Engel list authorities to publicly identify and sanction corrupt government officials, not only in Venezuela and Nicaragua, as was the case previously, but also in Guatemala, including 5 days ago, the current Attorney General. And in El Salvador, 5 members of the Constitutional Court who were illegally appointed by a Bukele legislative majority and ruled that he could be reelected despite an explicit prohibition in their constitution. And again, going back, in other ways, I think the Biden administration has reversed dangerous and damaging policies impacting directly on the region. He's returned the U.S. to the Paris Climate Accord. The U.S. has rejoined the COVAX Vaccine Clearinghouse. Also, we've rejoined WHO, and not only refunded PAHO, but added special resources to help PAHO help countries expand their cold chains and epidemiological and vaccine capabilities. And let me show you to some degree why this is important in the region. I think that you can see on the right hand, it shows that already in the Americas, there have been 88 million cases, 2 million, nearly 2.2 million deaths. That's about half the number of deaths worldwide. And in this chart, it shows the fact, which may not be understood, that three countries in the region, Peru, Mexico, and let me see, and Ecuador, show the highest rates of deaths, what they call the case fatality rate, in terms of percentage of those who die who have COVID. The percentage, just to give you an idea, in Mexico, 7.6% of those cases result in deaths. In Peru, 9.2%. In Ecuador, 6.4%. In the United States, 1.6%. The impact on the region, and this is basically as a result of the weak health systems in those countries. I think that I've stopped sharing. I hope I've stopped sharing. Have I stopped sharing? Good. I think that what we see is the question about how the region perceives the Biden administration's foreign policy, I suspect, is going to depend on how the Biden administration helps the region respond to COVID. And already, as I think that, as Cindy mentioned, this summer, the Biden administration had provided $217 million in pandemic relief and 40 million doses of vaccine donated. And that's separate from US funding for PAHO. Now, the administration also plans to buy 480 million doses of Pfizer worldwide, including a substantial amount to be donated in Latin America by the end of the year. And the need is clear. Well, by the way, Chile and Uruguay have the highest rates of vaccination in the hemisphere, 73%. Canada is next at 70. The US is 64% of those over 12. Only 23% of the people in the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean are fully vaccinated. The danger, as I think Cindy also mentioned, but that as the CEPAL Executive Secretary Alicia Bárcena said last week, is also economic. COVID has led to a 6.8% drop in GDP and the worst crisis in labor markets since 1950, with a 9% drop in the number of persons employed, as well as an increase to 11.3% living in extreme poverty, which is the highest level in 2 decades. As she's noted, the continuity of emergency cash transfers is critical, and if not, there'll be 15 million more people living in extreme poverty in Latin America in 2021. One of the ways the Biden administration can impact that is providing direct funding through USAID, and also at the IDB and World Bank, ensuring that those programs that currently underpin national cash transfer programs continue. And it's particularly important in the region. Again, given our history, Latin America and the Caribbean have always shown, unfortunately, the worst levels of income distribution in the world. This is the highest chart, shows that the Gini coefficient. This is Latin America and the Caribbean. That's the yellow dashed line. It's much worse than even sub-Saharan Africa. And as you can see, the black line represents industrialized countries. So income inequality in Latin America, even before COVID, was enormous. And that's getting substantially worse as a result of COVID. Going back again, the expectation is that the budget increase from Biden administration for Latin America is now $2.1 billion for this fiscal year that starts October 1. It's the most, that level is the most in more than a decade. And it contrasts with the Trump administration budgets, which sought to cut U.S. foreign aid by 30% or more. I will say that fortunately, Republican-led Congress joined Democrats to prevent that from happening, but the budget did not increase. The Biden request is about 16% more than appropriated last year, and a significant portion, some $860 million, is the first tranche in Biden's pledge to provide $4 billion over 4 years to address the root causes of irregular migration in Central America. The recognition of the need to address those root causes is fundamentally bipartisan, so far as the Congress, and is shown by national polling as far as US public opinion are concerned. Now, there's one other issue that I want to at least touch on, and that's the three-sided challenge of transnational crime, drug trafficking, and corruption that extends into law enforcement. Organized crime and drug cartels directly assault state institutions and citizen security in the Andes, Central America, and Mexico, and to a significant degree in the United States as well. Now, well-armed drug cartels with assault rifles and grenade launchers, made or purchased, most of them in the United States, kill each other for control over drug corridors. And that results, particularly in Mexico, in huge increases in homicides. Now, let me just give you some sense about what that looks like in terms of the drug trafficking. And where we are. Remember, this is something that this war has gone on now for 40 years. This is a chart. The green chart shows increase in cultivation over the course of the last 20 years or so. The green line, that's the US estimate. In terms currently, I think the last one there is just over 200 hectares. It's now 245. The dark blue line is the UN estimate. The point is that despite the differences, the same trend is shown. The only difference is the way they do their assessments. But it's clear that drug cultivation of cocaine, of coca, has continued virtually unimpaired by anything we've done or anything the Colombians have done over the course of the past 30 years. And what that does, this is the chart that shows where it moves from Colombia. It moves through Central America, into Mexico, and into the United States. How much? This is 2015, but I assure you that what we know is it's been about the same ever since. Somewhere over 90% goes from Colombia, particularly through the Pacific, and up into Central America, or directly overland through Central America, and in some cases by air into Honduras, but then through Guatemala into Mexico and the United States. When you know that that means somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 billion each year funneled up, the cartels have an enormous amount of capacity to finance weapons, to buy local officials, to corrupt police, and to kill people in order to get their product through to the United States. And they do kill people. This chart, which I assume you can see, is the chart on homicides in 2020. I think you can see it. And what it shows is that the homicide rate in Latin America and in the Caribbean is the worst again in the world. The difference, if you see Chile, it's somewhere around 3.5 homicides per 100,000. That's about where the United States is. Versus Jamaica, up around 40, Venezuela, Honduras, Mexico. And what that means is that a lot of that is related to the cartels, in Mexico particularly. Since the war against drugs in Mexico, let's say 2006, there have been several 100,000 homicides. There have also been tens of thousands of disappearances. And I would just note that you're talking about, and this is the statistics from the National Statistics Institute in Mexico, and a very competent think tank in Mexico called the Consejo Ciudadano para la Seguridad Pública y la Justicia Penal, Citizen Council for Public Safety and Criminal Justice, that recently reported of the 20 most violent cities in the world, Mexico had 7. Of the top 50 worldwide, 46 were in the Western Hemisphere, most in Latin America. The only positive during COVID, I would say, with respect to violence, is that there have been some very significant reductions in the murder rate in Central American countries. I believe that one of the most persistent flaws, and I have testified about this, in terms of US foreign policy since the end of the Central American conflicts in those countries, and in Mexico, and in Colombia, and most garishly in Haiti, has been the inability of the United States and the international community to help those countries achieve citizen safety and to organize competent, respected police and an independent judiciary. I'll touch as well, Cindy did, I'll just touch briefly on what I think is going to be a very significant challenge for the Biden administration globally, but also in the region. And that's China and its impact here. This chart is, I think, pretty impressive in showing how China has expanded its role. This is just Central America. So in the year 2000, somewhere under $2 billion of trade took place between China and Central America. 2019, it essentially increased by more than eight times. And if I had the numbers here, which I didn't today, in Mexico, it increased, and I repeat, it increased more than 30 times the level of trade between China and Mexico. About $80 billion exports from China to Mexico, and about 10 exports from Mexico to China. This is going to be a major issue for how the United States deals with it. And I think the hope, as Cindy said, is that he doesn't deal with it by creating another Cold War. And in fact, he's at the UN last week, he said that he would not do that. Or at least he tried not to. He said, but we'll compete, but we're not seeking, and I'll say it again, we're not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. Hopefully that will be the case. Although there's little doubt that managing relations with China will be one of the principal difficulties faced by the administration globally and in the Americas. So let me conclude by saying, what should be the key elements of the U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean? And I go back to the statement of the late Senator Ted Kennedy. Focus on democracy, good governance, anti-corruption, social justice and poverty elimination, and major assistance on both the health and economic consequences of COVID. And do it through cooperation, diplomacy, respect for the views of other nations. And that's the best way to advance U.S. foreign policy goals in the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was particularly, it's going to generate a fair amount of comment, I think. Let's, before we open it up to the questions from the audience, let's go back to Cindy and see if she has any specific comments on Mark's comments.
Mark, no, that was fantastic. Thank you. It was a tour de force of the last, 50 plus years of U.S. policy in the region. Congratulations. I'm not sure that you and I differ on too many things. What I struggle with, to be honest, is how we support democracy and roll back authoritarianism. It's one thing to talk about the right things, and it's another thing to actually do it. And Nicaragua right now is foremost in my mind. I'm sure that you, along with me, know many of the people that have been jailed by the regime in advance of the November 2021 presidential elections. I mean, what do you do when a government seems hell-bent on consolidating, its own rule, is willing to open fire on hundreds of young demonstrators and kill them in the streets, as it did in 2018, throw people into jail in advance of the elections to ensure re-election, what are and is increasingly reliant on Russia in security terms and whatever. And what we've seen in the case of Venezuela is that sanctions and economic pressure and all the other kinds of things that we might think of in the case of Nicaragua, including, although I'm not sure this is really so much on the table, kicking Nicaragua out of the Central America Free Trade Agreement. The consequence is that the Irans and Turkeys and Chinas and Russias of the world step in. China proved in the early, in the first decade of this century that there were many options for economic insertion, if you want to use that terminology, not just trade with the United States, and China now is the principal trading partner of, I don't know how many dozen Latin American and Caribbean countries. But the truth is that there are malign, malevolent actors that have no qualms about, confronting the United States and the hemisphere, and that provide a minimal cushion, when the United States tries to exert, more significant forms of coercive diplomacy. So I agree with you. Support democracy, support human rights, and when you have a really recalcitrant, case like the Nicaraguan case, what do you do? So I'm really I think there are answers, and I'm coming up with them. About targeting the economic interests of the Ortega family, of the Sandinista party, the pension funds controlled by the armed forces, all that kind of thing. But it is. It's very, very difficult. The other thing, though, that did not really come up in our conversation, that I'd just like to add before we turn to questions, is that the Democratic Party wants to support countries economically, but it does not want to conclude additional free trade agreements, which would benefit exporters in Latin America as well as U.S. exporters. And that is because, starting with the Obama administration, but also continuing now through Trump, and continuity through Joe Biden, the sense is that free trade benefits elites and disadvantages the United States, and compromises a key voting constituency in this country. And, I think that those, we have to be smarter about globalization in a way that allows developing countries to export to advanced industrial countries without driving a race to the bottom. And I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but that is a really key challenge. Thanks.
Mark?
I think on the first, my criticism, both with respect to Venezuela and with respect, some of my criticisms, and with respect definitely with Nicaragua, is the Trump administration did not have a strategy with respect to either country. In other words, sanctions are not a strategy. Sanctions are a tool that you use. And sanctions are rarely by themselves capable of bringing about an end result, particularly if you're seeking to change the regime. It just doesn't work. And the other is that when you're doing it unilaterally, as most of the United States sanctions were, we did not do enough to bring others in. So after we imposed the sanctions, we went to talk to others. I think you need to have a diplomatic strategy. I would argue that there wasn't even anything attempted with Nicaragua. And in talking to some other countries in the region, I can tell you that at least some of the governments felt that there was never an attempt by the Trump administration to talk to them about what was happening in Nicaragua and what could be done. And I think that's something that Biden, the administration, should do. Obviously, as you said, Cindy, one of the key things is supporting civil society in those countries and working, hopefully, to see a unified view on the part of the opposition in those countries, which also has not been there. And I think there's a distinction between individual sanctions and more general economic sanctions, particularly if you don't make exceptions for what we used to call basic human needs, that is humanitarian and other trade and activity that is clearly benefiting the most vulnerable in the population. But what I don't see is I don't see diplomatic strategies put forth with respect to Nicaragua. And in the case of Venezuela, we can only hope that the talks in Mexico that the Norwegians have facilitated, that the U.S. would become much more engaged in supporting those.
Thank you, Mark. We have a number of questions. I'm going to begin with Professor Emeritus Phil Brenner of American University, who said, and I'm going to summarize this somewhat, Biden as a candidate suggested that it would be positive to reverse the most draconian sanctions towards Cuba. And given the current humanitarian crisis in Cuba, would it be so difficult to permit Western Union, for example, to operate as a conduit for remittances, et cetera? In short, to make more flexible the current sanctions on Cuba. Mark, do you want to begin?
I don't think there's any question that that should be done. And I think that there's a range of actions that benefit, that the Cuban community here believes benefits either their relatives or in general the people, the Cuban people. And those actions, I think, should be taken to go back to the measures that were undertaken during the Obama administration.
Okay, Cindy?
Sure. I mean, I think the remittances and allowing them is sort of the low-hanging fruit. And the failure to do that, I think, has two roots. And Phil Brenner, Cuba policy, that's been the subject of earlier discussions in this series. Obviously, the shellacking that the Democrats took in Florida is a concern. The looking towards the midterm elections, the fear of losing even more seats. I don't think it's so much a question of national, the role of Florida in national elections, but not wanting to further erode, Democratic seats in Florida, and the sense that whereas I think Mark is right that there's an important constituency in the Cuban American community that wants to be able to send remittances to family members. There are other very outspoken people who have a much more radical point of view, which is that, the regime is on its knees, don't give it anything, to help the economy, and that's just going to help bring about its demise. I mean, that's the same rationale that was applied to Venezuela. The other issue that I think is out there is the concern that the opening of the relations between the United States and Cuba during the Obama administration did not produce any form of political opening flexibility or whatever within the regime. Rather that politics continued as usual, the arrests of dissidents, whatever, all of those things continued, and that there was no reciprocal indication from the Cuban government that it was, willing to respond to the softening of U.S. policy in the kinds of ways that the U.S. government was looking for, which was liberalization. So anyway, I noticed two people have put things in the chat. My last name, Phil, you should know, is not Arson, it's Arnson. And there's also an Arnson, that's not my last name either, Arnson. So Meg, I don't know how you want to go ahead and take questions.
I'll take the two that you mentioned. There's one that's linked somewhat to Phil Brenner's question, and that is, and this is to both of you, what do you think should be the Biden administration's policy towards Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which you just touched on it somewhat, three states that Bolton, a former national security advisor to Trump, called the Troika of tyranny. How much should the current Biden foreign policy towards those countries set aside the policies of the Trump administration. Cindy?
You want me to go first on that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look, there are countries that are close allies. Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba certainly are closely aligned in terms of foreign policy, in terms of supporting each other to the very limited extent that they can. Venezuela economically, with deliveries of oil, albeit at a reduced level. Nicaragua, I'm not sure, still receives subsidies through the Albanesa program, but it was an important form of cooperation. But anyway, quite apart from the way those three governments have allied with one another, I do not think it's appropriate for US policy to address them as a bloc, as opposed to individually. I think the dynamic of what's going on right now in Venezuela is very different than what has happened in the pre-electoral scene in Nicaragua, and is very different from what's taken place in Cuba. And each of those countries, has a lot in common with the other, but there are opportunities, I think, for US policy to, try to separate them and deal with them one-on-one. Now, again, the support for democracy, for human rights, for release of political prisoners, all that is common in the approach to all three, and should, frankly, in my view, be common to the approach to all three. But I just don't see a one-size-fits-all approach being very effective or helpful in any of those cases.
I agree with what Cindy just said, and I do think that there's an opportunity on the part of the Biden administration to engage with other countries in the region, particularly, I would say, on Nicaragua, and to some degree, I think that there's a way for the Biden administration, if it were to move in the direction that the Obama administration did on Cuba, to have an impact, a greater impact on both Venezuela and on Nicaragua. And I think that at least that effort should be explored. I think that at this point, one of the things that needs to be done is to do everything one can to help all three countries, though, deal with the humanitarian issues stemming from COVID. And I think that if the United States has the ability to donate vaccines, we should donate vaccines to all three countries through the UN, through PAHO, particularly in terms of ensuring that that they're handled in an appropriate way.
Thank you, Mark. Gretchen Sanchez has a question. Do you think that the Biden administration has realized that Latin America isn't a monolithic region and it needs to draft more than one foreign policy? Do you agree with this statement? What would be some specific policies depending on specific states in Latin America?
Mark, why don't you go first on this one?
Okay. I mean, to some degree, I think that you already see some policies that are distinctive in terms of the U.S. trying to define a role in assisting in countries in dealing with the root causes of migration in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. And I think that there is, in fact, a policy specifically aimed at those countries. On the other hand, I think the issue of corruption and dealing with problems of corruption and maybe strengthening some of the multilateral avenues for for dealing with that through using the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, using the Open Government Partnership, and supporting civil society throughout the region in monitoring something called social auditing, monitoring the degree to which their governments are complying with their obligations in terms of anti-corruption. I think that's hemispheric in nature. I similarly think that the U.S. could do more, should do more that helps the region deal with the problems of transnational crime. I think that that's an issue that has increasingly affected the well-being and safety of citizens throughout the region. And that chart that I showed from Inside Crime that showed the levels of homicides, that's just one aspect of it. There's been a significant increase in terms of extortion, in particular extortion affecting the small business and poorer communities, and something I think that the administration could take a lead in helping countries deal with.
Cindy, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I addressed this in my opening remarks. I mean, I think that the, one size fits all doesn't really apply anymore. There's just too much heterogeneity in the hemisphere, but there are some common approaches, whether it's on, climate change or supporting, as Mark was laying out, the access, population access to, vaccines, whatever. So those kinds of things could be across the board, but I don't think that a policy vis-a-vis Brazil necessarily tells you very much about what your policy should be towards Chile, or for that matter, Argentina. So I do think that despite the the numbers of embassies that are without an ambassador because Congress just doesn't seem interested in confirming, ambassadorial positions, that there is a lot of, constructive bilateral engagement, that goes on and that will go on even more now that Brian Nichols is in place.
Thank you, Cindy. We have two questions from Arturo Lopez Levy, professor of international affairs in beautiful, sunny California, hopefully. One is for Cindy Arnson. What factors explain the relative good situation in U.S.-Argentinian relations? And for Mark, do you agree with Cindy Arnson's view that it is not reasonable to expect a U.S. grand strategy towards the hemisphere? Let's start with Cindy.
Okay, I'll start on Argentina. I'm a little bit out of my element. We actually have an Argentina project in the Latin American program, and I think my colleague Benjamin Gadan would be much better at answering to this question. But I think there are a couple of things going on. Number one, despite the economic crisis in Argentina, it's the third largest economy in the region, after Brazil and Mexico. So it's certainly an important, economic player in Latin America. I think that there's also a desire on the part of the Biden administration to respect ideological pluralism, to show that it can work with a populist government democratically elected, and is not looking, to punish Argentina for the level of debt and what it owes to the IMF or whatever. The other part is that Argentina has China as its number one trading partner. I think you can look to the framework of US-China competition as a reason for trying to engage with the Fernandez regime or government, however you want to portray it. The recent trip by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and others to both Brazil and Argentina, I think was motivated principally by a concern that both countries are looking at Chinese technology, particularly Huawei, as a company to provide 5G technology, and there's a great deal of concern in the United States should Latin American countries start adopting Chinese 5G capabilities. And then there's another part as well, which is that precisely because Argentina and Mexico, often, and certainly under the Lopez Obrador government and also under Fernandez, have abstained on resolutions in the OAS to say, condemn Nicaragua or whatever, that those governments can be an alternative path to some form of engagement with governments with which the United States has disagreements, including Venezuela. And I think for the most part, those hopes are misplaced or have been shown to be misplaced. The Argentines are not terribly interested in engaging on Nicaragua, and AMLO in general is not necessarily interested in engaging on foreign policy at all. So although, is working with the US government on migration issues and also on Central America out of its own national interest and its southern border. So I'm not sure I can say much more. I'd be curious as to whether, Mark has anything to add to that on the Argentine portion before you take your own question.
Mark?
Let me go to the other question on Argentina. By the way, I think that
Mark, can you speak up?
okay, the last point that Cindy made, that it will not hurt the United States to show that it can deal with a populist government like the Argentine government, I think is accurate. It's also one of the things that goes back to the concerns about how the Cold War impacted on U.S. Latin American relations, where even if countries elected, democratically elected governments that were more on the left, the U.S. tended to exclude them or take actions against them. And I think I'm hoping ended with the Cold War, and hopefully that will not be reflected again in U.S. policy. Going to the question of whether there can be any strategic overall approach to Latin America as a whole, I think that Cindy's correct in the sense that there's not a single strategic approach that covers all countries, that there are many things that can be done with individual countries bilaterally. There are, as I mentioned earlier, sub-regionally in Central America. Clearly there are policies that can be carried out. The Caribbean Basin is another area where one could conceive of a greater degree of attention. I think, however, there are some areas that have not been stressed, which are interesting because the U.S. Biden administration has stressed them domestically. Infrastructure, the need to do something about about inequity and inequality, and obviously climate change. That all three of those, and I'd raise one other, which is education, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, which has had a tremendously negative impact on the education system in the region, that I could see the Biden administration, not just USAID, but the Biden administration as a whole, engaging with the international financial institutions to come up with policies that help the country, and in dialogue with the countries. That's really important. The dialogue with the countries about how they feel they can be helped to deal with existing problems in infrastructure, access to water, on the issue of roads and public transportation, as opposed to expanding carbon-based transportation, and as I say, dealing with the problems of climate. I believe that the Biden administration could come up with policies that would have an echo throughout the region.
Thank you, Mark. Before we wrap this up, I just want to mention the next 3 webinars that the Cuba program, together with the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University, will be hosting. On October 12th, Gabriel Vignoli, who's just come back from 3 months in Cuba, is going to be talking about the current situation within Cuba. And he's going to be joined by Hope Bastian from Wheaton College, who's just returned from 10 years in Cuba. So we're going to have some very well-informed individuals on the current situation in Cuba. On October 26th, as a result of popular demands, we're going to have a session. Remember, the title of this series is Cuba and Beyond. And the Beyond part is going to be represented on October 26th by Peru. And our two analysts will be Jo Marie Burt from the George Mason University and Cynthia McClintock from George Washington University, and both of whom have spent extensive time within Peru. The third person on the Peru side will be Martha Pro Santana, an expert on women's issues within Peru under the current conditions, economic and otherwise. And finally, on November 4th, the Cuba program will launch its book on whether or not environmental cooperation between the US and Cuba and the existence of several memorandums of understanding between the two countries that were signed between 2015 and 2017 provide essentially an access point for renewing dialogue between Cuba and the United States. And we will have Dan Whittle from the Environmental Defense Fund, David Farrer from the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and representatives from the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez from Cuba. And now I would like to thank both Cindy and Mark for extraordinarily incisive presentations. I don't think we've had as many very, very weighty presentations in amongst many very good presentations in our series. Both of your presentations are definitely getting A+. So thank you again, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
McCrahan is a former
Yep.
professor of mine, so I take that grade, very seriously. Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who joined.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it as always. Thank you very much, Meg, Cindy.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.